العالمين والصلاة والسلام الأتمان الأكملان على خاتم النبيين وسيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد, فإنشاءالlah we'll continue today with reading from the book known as al-Awsat في السنن والإجماع والاختلاف لأبي بكر Muhammad ibn Ibrahim ibn al-Mundhir, who died in the year 318 after the Hijrah. And we're in the section of his book known as Kitaab al-Miyaah, the section that deals with the different categories of water. And we've been talking about some of the different categories of water that is Najas, or al-Ma and Najas, water that is Najas. And we've talked about the disagreement of the scholars in this issue, where some of them say that Najas water is any small amount of water that has come into contact with something that is Najas, regardless if its taste, color, or smell has changed. And this is a view of a large portion of scholarship in Islam. And then there is another view that water doesn't become Najas regardless of its volume until and unless it changes its taste, color, or smell. And although this is the view of perhaps the minority, it is a strong view, and what I lean to from the statements of the scholars to be the stronger view in this issue. That being said, this disagreement can lead to scenarios that can be problematic for the individual. So, for example, if you hold the first opinion that water can be Najas even if its taste, color, or smell doesn't change, then this can lead to using Najas water without knowing. Because the water in your view could be Najas and you didn't know. And if there can be Najas water without you knowing, then you could possibly use it in your foods. You can use it for your purification. And if you purified using it, you would potentially have prayed with a wudu that was made with Najas water. So what is the ruling of such a wudu? And what is the ruling of such a salat? Especially if you don't find out until afterwards. And that's the chapter that the author has here for us based on this disagreement. He says, ذِكْرُ الْوُضُوءِ بِالْمَاءِ النَّجِسِ لا يعلم به المصلي إلا بعد الصلاة. What has been mentioned regarding making wudu with water that is Najas. And obviously here it's referring to water that is small in quantity and its taste, color, or smell hasn't changed. So you don't know it's Najas. So what has been what has been mentioned regarding using wudu with water that is Najas, or making wudu with water that is Najas, that is not known about by the individual praying until after the salat has finished. An individual made such a wudu and then offered salat, but wasn't aware that the water was Najas until after they had already prayed. Whether it be in the time period, right? You just prayed Asr, and then somebody comes and tells you, oh, by the way, this water is Najas that you used. Or whether it be after the time period, whether it be, Maghrib time now, or whether it be a day or two later that you find out that the water that you used was Najas. And does it make a difference how much time has passed and how many salat did you offer with such water, etc.? So all of these concepts are things that he's going to touch on in this topic, or things that are connected to this issue. The author, he says, اختلف أهل العلم في الرجل يتطهر بماء نجس لا يعلم به ويصلي ثم يعلم به بعد الصلاة. He says the people of knowledge have disagreed. And remember, the point of this book, السنن al-Awsat في السنن والإجماع والاختلاف, the medium-sized book that relates to the sunan, the narrations, and the consensus and the disagreement. And so that's why he presents every chapter by talking about what they've agreed upon and what they've disagreed upon, or what they disagreed about. So he says the people of knowledge have disagreed regarding a person who purifies using water that is Najas. that he doesn't know about, i.e., it's najasa. And then he offers salat. And then after offering salat, he learns that the water was najis. They disagree about a person who purifies using water that is najis that he doesn't know about, and he prays. And then he learns about it after the salat, i.e., after the salat is over. So, as he always does, he breaks it down into opinions first. Who holds what opinion? He says, فقالت طائفة يعيد ما دام في الوقت وليس عليه أن يعيد إذا مضى الوقت. هذا قول مالك وابن القاسم عنه. He says, one group of scholars, they say the individual needs to re-pray. He needs to repeat the prayer as long as it's within the same time period. And there's nothing upon him after that to repeat if the time period has passed. And this is the view of Malik, according to Ibn al-Qasim anhu, right? According to what Ibn al-Qasim stated about him. And we see this is a common theme from Imam Malik. Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, even in things that he didn't necessarily believe was obligatory, right? And so, for example, if we go back to our previous chapter or a chapter or two ago, we saw that who are the people that said that water doesn't become najis by contact? And if I'm not mistaken, the author he mentioned from those who hold that view is Imam Malik. So let's go back to that statement. He said, وقالت طائفة قليل الماء وكثيره لا ينجسه شيء إلا أن يغلب عليه النجاسة بطعم أو لون أو ريح وهذا قول يحيى القطان وعبد الرحمن بن مهدي وقد روينا أخبارا عن الأوائل تدل على ذلك. Here it doesn't mention that that's the view of Imam Malik. But if I'm not mistaken, it's a statement attributed to Imam Malik in this issue. Now, ala kulli hal, the point that I was making is that Imam Malik, you find a theme in his statements, and that is even in things that he doesn't believe is necessarily obligatory, he'll command an individual to repeat the prayer because of them, as long as it's during the time period. Because there's no harm in repeating during the time period to be sure, to be positive that you have performed the obligation in a way that is suitable. So, like for example, we studied in the Muwatta, for example, we came across the narration a few weeks back that Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala was asked about an individual, سئل عن رجل subhanallah, سئل عن رجل نسي. You had تمضمض قبل أن يغسل وجهه أو غسل وجهه قبل أن يغسل ذراعيه. And then the other one was about a man who forgot to wash his face and then he prayed, or no? Now I got to remember. This is the problem with work. We talked about in class previously with work, and this is the reason why we've been so absent this week. It affects the memory, and being preoccupied can affect the memory. And Allah knows best that we were preoccupied this week. نعم سئل مالك عن رجل توضأ فنسي فغسل وجهه. No, سئل مالك عن رجل توضأ ونسي أن يتمضمض أو يستنثر. Now, Imam Malik was asked about a man who made wudu but forgot to wash his mouth and his nose. And in that situation, Imam Malik, he said, ليس عليه أن يعيد الصلاة. No. It was the first one about a man who washed he washed his face before he washed his arms. And so Imam Malik, even though he doesn't see that it's necessarily obligatory to go in order, he said, يعيد غسل وجهه ثم يغسل ذراعيه حتى يكون قد غسلهم بعد أن غسل وجهه إذا كان في وقت وحضرة ذلك. If he was still in the time and in close proximity to that action. The point of all of that is just to recall that Imam Malik, from his view, is that he would often command a person to redo an action as long as it was in the time period, because there's no excessive hardship in redoing the action while you're still in the time period, and the benefit of guaranteeing yourself accuracy in the action is the most important thing. So even though Imam Malik might not even see it to be obligatory at times, he would still command that a person repeat it during the time period. So that's the first view. The first view is that if you're in the time period, then you should repeat it. If you made wudu with this water that some believe is najis, and it was still the time period, dhuhr or asr, for example, and then you found out after you prayed, you should remake the salat with pure water that is unarguably pure. This is the view of Malik. Ibn al-Mundhir, he says, وَفِيهِ قَوْلٌ ثَانٍ وَهُوَ آسف. He says, وَحُكِيَ عَنْهُ وحكى عنه أبو عبيد أنه كان يقول إذا تغيرت في البئر وتفسد يعني الدابة التي تنجس البئر فإنهم يرون كل صلاة صلوها بذلك الماء ويغسلون الثياب التي أصابها. There's a second opinion of Imam Malik in this issue as well. He says, and it's also been reported from him, i.e. from Malik, by Abu Ubaid, that he, and Abu Ubaid here is al-Qasim ibn Salam, that he used to say, i.e. Imam Malik used to say, if the water has changed in the well, if the well water has changed and has become rancid or fouled or contaminated by, i.e. the animal that has fallen into it and died, right? Because this was the most practical scenario of how this would happen. You would have an animal in a well that had died, and the well water is a small amount like we covered last time, and a person would take a bucket out of that well and make wudu. And then afterwards, they would find the animal dead in the well, and they didn't know about it before they used the water. And so now they're, unsure, was the animal in the well before they made wudu or afterwards? And is there a difference? And, what happens to the prayers that they prayed? So this is the most common scenario that this used to happen in the past. The second view of Imam Malik, according to Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Salam, is that he said that if the water changes in the well and becomes contaminated because of the animal that has fouled the well, then they need to repeat every prayer that they offered with that salat. With that they prayed, with that wudu, with that water, and they need to rewash the clothing that was washed with that water. And here, it's a little bit even more clearer the view of Imam Malik. If the water changed, then the water is najis, without a doubt. And if you used najis water, then without a doubt, you need to re-pray every salat that you prayed with that najis water. And without a doubt, you need to rewash the clothes that you washed with that najis water. If that water had changed its taste, color, or smell because of something najis, and you didn't find out that that smell, color, or change was because of something najis until after the fact, like, for example, you might have well water that's brown or has a tint of brightness in it, and you don't know what that discoloration is from, right? It could just be from the rocks or from the sediment in the water or something like that. And so you use it thinking that it's okay. And then later on, you found out that that brownness was because of an animal that had died in the water. We now know that that water had changed its taste, color, or smell because of something najis that you were unsure about before. And so you used it. But now you know for sure that it was najis at the time of usage. And so in this circumstance, you need to repray every salat that you made with that water. And you need to rewash every garment that you've washed with that water, because that water was najis for certain at the time of your usage. As opposed to the other opinion of Imam Malik, which was that you don't need to do so unless it's still in the same time period, i.e. if the water didn't change, but you found out afterwards that it had some contaminants in it, then just re-pray if you're still in the time period. And so like that, you see that there's a way to put the two opinions of Imam Malik together without them being contradictory. Now, he says, وَفِيهِ قَوْلٌ ثَانٍ. So that's the first opinion. Yes, in some circumstances, you need to re-pray. And those circumstances can change based on the time period or based on the extent of contamination. He says, وفيه قول ثان وهو أن يعيد الصلاة في الوقت وبعد خروج الوقت لا يجزئه غير ذلك وهذا قول الشافعي. He says there's a second opinion in this issue, and it is that the salat needs to be redone during the time period as well as after the time period. And it is not sufficient anything less than that. And this is the view of a Shafi'i. Because as we mentioned, a Shafi'i sees that the water is najis by simple contamination, even if it doesn't change. And if the water is najis, then that prayer is invalid. And so it's necessary for you to go back and re-offer that salat no matter when you find out about it, whether it was during the time or after the time. That's the second opinion. He says, وَفِيهِ قَوْلٌ ثَالِث وهو أن الرجل إذا توضأ بماء وقع فيه بول أو نجاسة ما كانت النجاسة وصلى ولم يعلم بذلك ثم علم أن عليه يعيد الوضوء والصلاة كلها إذا كان على يقين من أنه توضأ بذلك الماء من بعد أن حلت فيه النجاسة فإن هو توضأ من ماء بئر وصلى ثم وجد فيها فأرة أو دجاجة أو فأرة أو دجاجة ميتة قد انتفخت أو تفسخت ولا يعلم متى وقعت فيها فإن النعمان قال على من توضأ من تلك البئر وصلى أن يعيد الوضوء ويعيد الصلاة 3 أيام ولياليهن. وإذا كان قد غسل بذلك الماء ثوبا أو أعيد فغسل بماء نظيف وإن كان قد أصاب الثوب منه أكثر من قدر الدرهم الكبير وصلى فيه يوما أو أقل فعليه أن يعيد ما صلى فإن وجد الدجاجة أو الفأرة لم تتفسخ أو لم تنتفخ ولم يعلم متى وقعت فيها فإنه يعيد الوضوء ويعيد الصلاة يوم وليلة وهذا قول نعمان. طيب. As we always mention, when there's all of this extra detail, and often you'll find that this extra detail is from the Ahnaf. It's not always, right? Other people do it as well. But because the Ahnaf are what are known as Ahl al-Ra'i, the people of opinion in, whatabouts, then you find often that they have a lot of extra detail. And as we often mention, this extra detail is often a sign of the validness of the opinion just because of how much detail there is without any evidence for. So we have one opinion, you have to re-pray during the time. And then also at the same time, some people say you have to re-pray everything if the water had changed. And then we have a second opinion that even if the water didn't change, you have to re-pray during the time or after the time. And now here there's a third opinion, he says, and it is that if a person makes wudu with water that has had urine or najasa contaminated, regardless of what kind of najasa it is, and then he offered salat without knowing about that contaminant in the water, and then he comes to find out or he learns about it later, then upon him is to repeat the wudu and the salat, all of them. Right? So it's similar to the statement of Shafi. He has to redo everything. إذا كان على يقين من أنه توضأ بذلك الماء. As long as he is certain that the water that he is using or that he used was water that was contaminated at the time of using it, after the najasa had already fallen into it. Right? So for example, like I said, the example that's commonly used, and this is the connection to the previous chapter, is about well water. Because the person isn't watching a well 24/7. You might get up in the morning, you go to the well, you take your personal water for the day, and you make wudu. It's nighttime, it's fajr, it's dark. You can't even see the water perfectly. You don't smell anything, you don't taste anything when you put it in your mouth, and you take the water home and you offer fajr. And then later on, you come to find out that that water was contaminated. So here we have, varying scenarios. Do you know that that water was contaminated when you used it? So for example, you got the water for Fajr and it was dark and you used it. And then when the sun rose, you saw that the water's color had changed because of something Najas. And you know that nothing has contaminated the well since you've used it. Then you know for sure here that you've used Najas water. And so in this circumstance, you need to repray everything that you prayed with that wudu. And you need to rewash everything that you've washed with that water. And so this is similar to the second opinion of Imam Malik. As opposed to if you are uncertain, did that water become contaminated before or after you used it? And so how is that the case? You used the water at Dhuhr time and it didn't appear contaminated to you. And then by Maghrib time, it's been announced that there's a dead animal in the well, right? So in this circumstance, did the dead animal get in there between Dhuhr and Maghrib, or was it in there before Dhuhr? Or maybe a day or two later, you find the animal in the well. Was it in there yesterday and it just now floated to the top, or did it fall in there today? Right? And so in this circumstance, you're unsure when the water was contaminated. So if you're sure that you've used the contaminated water, then without a doubt, you need to remake wudu and you need to rewash everything. But if you're unsure if the water was contaminated before or after, then here comes these details we talked about. He says, فَإِنْ هُوَ تَوَضَّأَ مِنْ مَاءِ بِئْرٍ وَصَلَّى. If the individual, however, used water from the well and offered salat, and then afterwards it was found in the well a dead mouse or a dead chicken, and that mouse or chicken had become bloated, waterlogged from the falling into the water, or if it began to deteriorate, if it began to decompose, right, to break apart in the water, and it is not known when that animal fell in. So you don't know, did it fall in before you used it or after you used it? And it's already become bloated and it's already started to decompose in the water and break apart. So you've used it at Dhuhr today, or you've been using the well. And then at Maghrib, we found a dead chicken in the water. And that chicken has become bloated from being in the water and has started to break apart, right? And we don't know when the chicken fell in. It's not like somebody saw it or knows exactly when it happened, so we can use a time filter. He says, فَإِنَّ النُّعْمَانِ, then according to an-Nu'man, yani Abu Hanifa, an-Nu'man ibn Thabit, he says, upon this individual who made wudu with that water from the well and prayed, he needs to redo the wudu and re-offer the prayer for 3 days and nights. Water that has become contaminated, it didn't change. And then later, at some point in time, you found out that there was a dead animal in it, and that dead animal is bloated and decomposing. And you don't know when that dead animal fell in. All of these details. In that circumstance, you need to re-pray 3 days and nights worth of salat, i.e. 15 salat. From the moment you find out, 3 days and nights prior to that. He says that's the first view, right? If it's decomposed. He says, وَإِذَا كَانَ قَدْ غَسَلَ بِذَلِكَ الْمَاءِ ثَوْبًا أُعِيدَ. And likewise, if you've washed any garments using that water, then you need to repeat that. فَغُسِلَ بِمَاءٍ نَظِيفٍ. And it needs to be rewashed with fresh water or clean water. And if وَإِنْ كَانَ قَدْ أَصَابَ الثَّوْبَ مِنْهُ أَكْثَرَ مِنْ قَدْرِ الدِّرْهَمِ الْكَبِيرِ وَصَلَّ فِيهِ يَوْمٍ أَوْ أَقَلَّ فَعَلَيْهِ أَنْ يُعِيدُ مَا صَلَّى. Likewise, if any of your garments had been affected by that water, an amount that is a large dirham in size or greater, then, and you've prayed in that garment for at least a day, or even, for a day or less, then upon him is to repray that salat, right? This is another scenario. You didn't make wudu with that water, and you didn't wash your clothes with that water, but somebody had a bucket of that water and it splashed on your clothes. If the amount that got on your clothes is greater in size than a dirham, right? And a dirham is about the size of a penny, between the penny and a nickel, as far as in its circumference. Uh, if it's a size of a large dirham and you prayed in that thobe that was contaminated by that water, and the reason why they limit it to a size of a large dirham or greater is because the Hanafi madhab says that a small amount of najasa in any circumstance is excusable if it's lesser than a dirham in size. So like when you're cleaning yourself and maybe there's some contaminant left or some filth left, as long as it's less than an amount of a dirham. Or if, some, spots of blood from which you slaughtered get on your clothing, as long as they total less than a dirham or less, right? Less than a dirham, then the Hanafi method is that amount is excusable. You don't even have to worry about it. But if it's more than that, then this is when the rules start applying. And so that's why they say if it's less than the amount of a large dirham, I'm sorry, more than an amount of a large dirham, and you prayed in that garment a day or less, i.e. any salat, then upon you is to repeat what you prayed wearing that garment. So all of this is in the condition that the water had in it an animal that had become bloated and began to disintegrate. He says, but if they found in it a chicken or a mouse that has not begun to disintegrate or become bloated, and it is not known when that animal has fallen into the well, then in that circumstance, they only need to repeat the salat of one day along with the night. This is the statement of Nu'man and Zufar, right? From the Ahnaf, Abu Hanifa and one of his students, Zufar, had this opinion. So we see these conditions. One, you have to not know when the najasa fell into the water. And then after that, we distinguish. Has it begun to disintegrate and become bloated or not? And if it has, then 3 days and nights. If you use that water directly, or if you wash your clothes with that water, you have to repray everything that you prayed in with those garments. And likewise, if that water got on some of your garments and you prayed in them, you need to repray that salat as well. But if it was not disintegrating or became bloated, then you only need to repray one day and night based on the wudus that you made with that water. Now, so that's the opinion number 3. And so, like I say, all of that detail, right, you're going to expect that, and you're going to come to expect that from the Hanafi madhab. Now, not everybody in the Hanafi madhab agrees with Abu Hanifa, and this is something that happens often, right? And a lot of Hanafis are actually unaware of this sometimes. Not a lot, but some of the Hanafis are actually unaware of this, that some of them say up to 2/3 of the madhab was altered by Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, right? They had contradictory or different opinions from Abu Hanifa. And, this is an important concept to understand for those that you might find to be really adherent and blind following of any madhab for that matter, but specifically the Hanafi madhab. And they often, have an exaggerated love for Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, while at the same point in time, they don't know that the opinions that they're following in the madhab, Abu Hanifa actually had an opinion contrary to that. And the opinion that's in the madhab that later became the madhab is actually that which his students like Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan disagreed with him in. And some of them have said that this reaches up to 2/3 of the madhab. And so in that circumstance, is it really even, accurate to ascribe it to Abu Hanifa when so much of the madhab has been altered? And so an example of that, he says here, وَقَالَ يَعْقُوب وَمُحَمَّد, يعني Ya'qub, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, 2 of the more prominent students of Abu Hanifa and the ones who compiled the madhab. He says, Ibn al-Mundhir, وَقَالَ يَعْقُوب وَمُحَمَّد وُضُوءُهُ وَصَلَاتُهُ جائزات عنه وليس عليه أن يعيد شيئا من الصلوات ولا بأس بالعجين الذي خبز بذلك الماء أن تأكل ولا يغسل ثوبه حتى يعلم أن ذلك كله كان بعد وقوع الفأرة الميتة في البئر لأنه عسى أن يكون صبيا أو غيره ألقاه في البئر بعد أن توضأ منها هذا الرجل وهو متغير. He says that as far as Yaqub and Muhammad, then the two of them say that the wudu of this individual and the salat that he made with this water, this water that wasn't changed at the time that he used it, and there were no signs of its contamination, but then afterwards it's found to have some contaminant in it that he learns about subsequently. The two of them say that the wudu of this individual and his salat, all of them are valid. All of the prayers and all of the wudus that he made using this water, all of it is valid for him. And he does not need to redo any of the salawat. And there's no problem with the dough that he made bread from using this water. Right? You know, the dough is the flour and the water that makes the ajeen, the dough. And then they bake from that bread. That bread has this water in it that it was made from. He says there's no problem with the bread. You can eat the bread. There's no problem with that bread for an individual that was made using that water to be eaten. Nor does he need to rewash any of his clothing. And this is the case as long as he is uncertain and this is the case unless he knows for sure that all of these things happened after the dead mouse fell into the well. Meaning all of these things are true unless the individual knows for sure that the water that was used was after this dead animal fell into the well. And this is because perhaps a young child or other than him might have thrown that dead animal into the well after it had already began to change, i.e., after the animal had already begun to deteriorate, right? And so if that's the case, if it had already began to deteriorate or what's the word, decompose, then they threw it into the well. And so their view is based on the principle to leave something the way it was. The ruling of this water was tahir until it's known to be najas. So leave it that way. As well as the principle al-yaqeen la yuzalu bishak. Certainty is not removed by conjecture. So we know for sure the water was clean, and we have conjecture, did it happen before or after? And so this is how they formulate their view. And this is obviously about water that hasn't changed. So this is a fourth opinion, if you will. He says, وحكى ابن المبارك عن النعمان أنه قال إذا أصابه دم فلم يدري متى أصابه فإنه يعيد الصلاة يوم وليلة. He says that Ibn al-Mubarak, yani Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, and it should be known that Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak was considered a Hanafi, right? From the scholars of Hadith, the scholars of Islam, from the best of the Atba' al-Tabi'een, and he was one who valued and followed the way of Abu Hanifa in issues of fiqh. The likes of him and Waqi' and Yahya ibn Ma'in, there were a lot of early Salafi scholars who were Hanafi. So, you know, despite some of the criticism that is levied against Abu Hanifa, there were early scholars who valued him and held him in high esteem. And from them is Ibn al-Mubarak. Ibn al-Mubarak, he said on Ibn and in Nu'man, yani on the authority of Abu Hanifa, and this is an issue that is similar to this topic, although different, but you can use it for comparison. He says, if an individual has been contaminated with blood that he doesn't know about, when did it affect him, then he should repray the salat of a day and a night. An individual finds blood on his body, dried blood on his person or on his clothing, right? And this happens, especially with older people, right? My father would often find injuries and bruises that he didn't know where it happened or how they came. And likewise, people who are in, you know, professions that require manual labor, you know, they'll find out, oh, subhanAllah, I'm bleeding. I didn't even know. And so if an individual finds blood on his body, according to Abu Hanifa, and he doesn't know when he was contaminated, then Abu Hanifa says he should repray the salat for one day and one night. right? And this is obviously if the blood is in a place where he wouldn't have known about it. Like, for example, if the blood is on his hand and he makes wudu, then he would have seen it earlier. So he knows that it's not one day and one night. But like, for example, if he finds blood on his thigh or blood on his stomach or something like this, and he doesn't know when he was contaminated, when he was injured, then Abu Hanifa says he only needs to re-pray for one day and one night. And this is obviously according to the view of those who say that blood is najis. And so they hold this view because the blood is najis, and so the salat was invalid. While the reality of it is, Allah knows best. Oh our Lord, do not hold us accountable for that which we forgot or we made a mistake about. And so if an najasa is on a person and he is unaware of it, then he doesn't need to redo anything, and Allah knows best. But our goal here isn't to talk about what's accurate and what's inaccurate. It's to present the information in the book. But the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he removed his shoes after Jibril informed him that there was najasa upon them, is an evidence for us in this issue. But in any circumstance, he brings this tangent because of its close comparability to the issue of finding the dead animal in the well. And that is things that you are unsure about when they happened. The precaution isn't to say that they happened right now. The precaution is to say that they happened a day in advance or 3 days in advance based on these details that Abu Hanifa uses. And they're not ridiculous, right? We see that Abu Hanifa, why does he differentiate between if the animal had began to decompose or bloat? Because usually that takes an amount of time. And so by the time you find the animal is decomposed and began to bloat, it had to have been a day or two at least, if not more. And if you find an animal in the well that hadn't done those things, then it hasn't been in the well long enough to do those things. The same way our CSI units and things like that figure time of death. It's not an exact science. Rigor mortis and liver temperature and things like that are all just likely signs that this is when this happened. And so in the view of the Ahnaf, even if it isn't what you agree with, it is a basis upon which that we can use in contemporary issues like crime scene investigation, forensics, and things like that, right? We found that the Salaf used all of these type of circumstantial pieces of information to make determinations and rulings. The Nasaba, the individual who could look at somebody's feet and tell that they were from the same, that they had a blood relationship, right? And nowadays we have DNA. So is DNA a valuable source of evidence? We say yes. And the Salaf uses it, even though DNA is not infallible, right? You'll find these turuq al-hukmiyya, they call it, like the methods in which one can establish a judgment. And we found that the Salaf used to use examples of this. Whether you agree with the particular issue or not, we found a foundation for it amongst the Salaf and the Prophet, the Sahaba, and the Imma, and things like that. Now, let's finish up. So those are, up until now, some of the issues that he's mentioned. We mentioned about 4, maybe 5, if you want to separate the statements of Imam Malik. He says, وقال عبد الله وعلى قياس قول سفيان يتحرى والتحري أن يشك أن يشك أن يشك أن يشك يشك أن يشك في يوم أو يومين فيأخذ بيومين. He says that Abdullah says, and Abdullah here is Ibn al-Mubarak, right? Because the last statement was attributed to Ibn al-Mubarak. So he says, Yani Ibn al-Mundhir says that Abdullah said about this last statement that he mentioned from Abu Hanifa, وَعَلَى قِيَاسِ قَوْلِ Sufyan, and according to the qiyas of Sufyan's statement, Sufyan, Yani al-Thawri, Sufyan ibn Sa'id ibn Masruq al-Thawri, Abu Muhammad. He had a madhab as well. And his madhab at that time was one that rivaled the madhab of Abu Hanifa, especially amongst the people of Kufa. And you found that the people of Hadith from the people of Kufa and that area, Basra and things like that, Iraq, they were more inclined to the madhab of Abu Muhammad, Sufyan al-Thawri, than they were to the madhab of Abu Hanifa. more of the people of hadith adopted the madhab of Abu Hanifa than they did the madhab of they adopted the madhab of Athori more than they did the madhab of Abu Hanifa. And Athori rahimahullah ta'ala, he had a book known as Masail, right? His issues of Athori. And Abu Dawood, he mentions it, and others mention it. But unfortunately, it's been lost through the time, right? We don't have access to that book anymore. And so you find that what some of them do is that they try to go through the books like the Musannafat and like this book and like Sunan al-Kubra al-Bayhaqi and other than that, and try to re-piece together the madhab of Sufyan al-Thawri. Because his madhab was one that was prominent and popular and well followed, but it has since died away. And so Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, he's saying here, based on comparing to the statements of Sufyan in his madhab, instead of just using this, precise measurement of time to determine, like Abu Hanifa did, one day, that's it. Sufyan, he says, according to his view, an individual should yataharra. He should try to select what is more accurate. And the selecting what is more accurate is that if an individual is in doubt, was that blood on him for 1 day or 2 days, he should say that it was 2 days. I al-bina ala ma yu'lam yaqinan, to do what you know for sure. And in negation, the thing that you know for sure is always further away than it is closer. So you don't know when you were contaminated. You don't know if it was 1 day or if it was 2 days. Ibni ala al-yaqin, based on what you know for sure. And so some people say, well, the only amount that you know for sure is the smaller of the two numbers. And so they say, therefore, you only base it to be 1 day. While others say, no, you know that it was 1 day or 2 days. And so the thing that you know for sure is 2 days, because you're in doubt, was it or was it not the second day? And so this is just how they differentiate about building on certainty. And the same thing applies in salat. Like, you forgot, did you pray a rak'ah or not? Build on certainty. So some of them say certainty is to count it as the last one that you know for sure. And then other narration says, فَلْيَتَحَرَّى, right? He should select based on what he feels more comfortable about. And that means using signs and things like that. In these circumstances, this is the statement of Sufyan al-Thawri, that if he's in doubt, is it 1 day or 2 that he was contaminated, then he should base it on the greater of the two numbers. Finishing up, he says, وكان أبو عبيد يقول الحد عندنا إذا كان الماء كثيرا يزيد على القلتين والثلاثة فلا إعادة عليهم، فإن غلبت نجاسة بطعم أو ريح فعليهم إعادة كل صلاة صلوها منذ يومئذ وكذلك يغسلون كل ثوب أصاب منه شيء. Here he says, as far as Abu Ubaid, yani Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Salam, he said that the limit or the rule with us is that if the water was a large amount, and this goes back to that previous chapter or two ago, if the water was a large amount and that it was increased above being kullatain or thalatha, 2 or 3 kulla, then they don't need to repray any salat. And this is obviously if the water's taste, color, or smell hadn't changed. But if the najasa overpowered the taste or smell of that water, then they need to repray every salat that they prayed from that moment. And likewise, they need to wash every garment that was contaminated with this water. So Abu Qasim, his opinion is that if the water was a large amount and it didn't change, there's no need to redo. And if it was if it was a large amount, or if a small amount that did change, or a large amount that did change, then you need to redo everything that you know for sure was najis. And this is the principle. If you know for sure that the water you used was najis, then redo it. And if you're unsure because it hadn't changed or you didn't find out until later, then leave the things the way that they were. This is the view of al-Qasim, but he qualifies it with a large amount of water. And as far as us, then we know that the opinion of Ibn al-Mundhir and others who adopt that opinion is that there's no difference between a large and a small amount. And that's why Ibn al-Mundhir, he ends this chapter off by saying, والذي نقول به أن ننظر إلى الماء الذي توضأ به المتوضئ وصلى فإن كانت النجاسة غيرت طعمه أو لونه أو ريحه فعليه الإعادة في الوقت وبعد خروج الوقت وغسل كل ثوب وبدن أصابه من ذلك الماء شيء قل أو كثر وإن لم تكن النجاسة غيرت للماء طعما ولا لونا ولا ريحا فلا إعادة عليه وإن شك فلم يدري هل غيرت الماء أم لا فالماء على أصل طهارته. هذا الذي أقول به. Abu Bakr ibn al-Mundhir, he says, and as far as us, then that which we say in this issue is that an individual should look at the water that he has made wudu with when making wudu and the water that he used to make a wudu when he prayed. And so if the water has najasa in it that has changed its taste, color, or smell, then he needs to repray. He needs to repray, regardless if it's during the time period or after the time period have left. And he needs to wash every garment and body part that has been contaminated with that water, with any of that water, whether it was a large amount or whether it was a small amount or a large amount. And if an individual doesn't know if the najasa that changed the water's taste or color or smell, if he doesn't notice that the najasa changed the water's taste, color, or smell, then there is no need for him to repeat. Meaning, if you look at the water and you can't tell it's been changed, there's no need to repeat. And he says, and if an individual is in doubt, and so he doesn't know, was that water changed when he used it or not, then the foundation of water is that it remains on its purity. And so this last segment, this last paragraph, Allah knows best, is the stronger view in the issue, and we'll suffice ourselves with that amount. The next chapter is connected to this topic as well, and it is the chapter regarding what has been mentioned about the dough that has been made using Najas water. If you have dough, bread, right, dough from flour and water, and the water you use was contaminated, what is the ruling about that dough? What should you do with it? Should you throw it away? Is this wasting food? Does the fire clean it when it cooks it, etc.? He'll talk about that next issue. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Just to remind, shortly, our Sheikh Asim al-Qaryuti will be visiting us here in St. Louis in the end of November, the beginning of December. November 26th will be the first class. And so towards the middle of November, all classes will be stopping in preparation for that until after the Sheikh Hafidhullah Ta'ala leaves from amongst us. So I just want to give a heads up regarding that. And likewise, if anybody can find time and an ability to make their way here to St. Louis for the Sheikh, those dates will be on the 26th to the 1st of December. Books will be distributed. We'll be going over the Thulathiyat of Imam Ahmed, as well as a Risala by Abdurrahman al-Sa'di in the encouragement of the unity of the Muslims and their coming together, as well as questions and answers, obviously, and things, additional, general talks. So we encourage everybody to, participate with us. It will be broadcast potentially, I'm not sure, but the best thing to do is to make your way to the masjid. If you're worried about hotels and accommodations, brothers who are, coming without their families, you can feel free to stay in the masjid, inshallah, during that time. We should have arrangements for you as far as sleeping arrangements. And like I said, books will be distributed and things like that. So we encourage everybody to try to come and make their way for that. That will be the 26th of November to the 1st of December. And then after that, the Sheikh Hafidhullah Ta'ala will be going to New York and, Jersey area and spending some time with our brothers up there. طيب. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Are you still in St. Louis? Yes, we're still at the masjid in St. Louis. Uday, naam, I remember you, akhi, alhamdulillah. Yeah, we're there at the masjid, inshallah. Just call us. You should have our number, inshallah. 314-320-1041. No, I didn't move to Kuwait. That's our brother Abu Muawiyah. We're still at Grand Masjid. Uh, Now we're still at Grand Masjid. Someone at the Grand Masjid told me he doesn't teach there anymore. No, I don't think anybody said that. I was there today. They might have been talking about class today. Specifically, if you were there today, then we didn't have class today. At Grand Masjid, we usually teach on Jumu'ah, after Asr and Maghrib, and on Sept, on Saturday, usually from like 2 till Isha. We have classes in Arabic after Asr on Saturday, and we have Alfiyatul Iraqiyya before Asr on Saturday. And on Jumu'ah, we do the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And we're going to continue to pick back up with Iqtida Sirat al-Mustaqim after Maghrib, inshallah. وفيكم بارك الله. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.